It would hardly be an understatement to say that The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the most anticipated and divisive games in the past few years. It was delayed multiple times and was rewritten almost entirely amid the firing of the original writers, resulting in Neil Druckmann stepping in himself as director and reworking the story to something he thought was more palatable. Well, this turned out to be an absolute nightmare for Naughty Dog, as the game's entire plot details and core mechanics were leaked only weeks before its June 19th release. Upon this revelation of the game's story, Naughty Dog immediately backpedaled and did their best to cover their tracks as thousands of people lambasted the plot and character details in an event Druckmann himself called the worst day of his life. Hope was not lost, however. The game was released, and plenty of fans, myself included, ignored the rumors and spoiler leaks and played the game for what it was. So why was this game so divisive? Is it really that bad? Long story short, no. As a game, it's absolutely revolutionary in terms of visuals and atmosphere. The gameplay and combat is addicting and satisfying, and the environment is second to none. So why all the criticism? In short, the story leaves a lot of questions, and certain details are extremely controversial, rewrites and direction notwithstanding. I won't get into the story details just yet, but trust me, it gets interesting. First and foremost, immediately after starting the game, you're met with a vibrant, vivid environment full of life and beautiful visuals. Kind of ironic considering the game's setting. It starts off in a compound in Jackson, Wyoming, where you see our familiar main characters again, 4 years after the events of the first game. Right away, you get a taste of the game's atmosphere with the refurbished wooden township and rustic, run-down storefronts and bars. It looks like a veritable Wild West town, a perfectly believable sight in a world such as this. When you finally take control of Ellie, you get to experience and explore the town for yourself, in all its Midwest glory. The whole area feels lively and livable, with a diverse population of characters, some of which interact with Ellie directly and feel very human. Overall, the main town of Jackson feels almost like a Universal Studios Wild West backdrop, and you almost want to have a gunslinger duel right in the middle of town. Anyway, as the plot kicks off, the setting changes from rural Wyoming to the big city of Seattle, Washington. Right away, the difference is staggering. The scene opens up on an abandoned, overgrown highway overpass full of cars and run-down road signs. If the game didn't explicitly tell you that you're in Seattle, it wouldn't be hard to tell. The ground around you is covered in tall grass, and the buildings are mossy and green from 25 years of letting nature take its course. The wet and humid environment is absolutely stunning at times, and it leaves plenty of opportunities for some amazing photos of the world around you. Early on in the story, you are met with a small, semi-open world to explore, complete with large, several-story buildings and areas that are fully explorable and will yield supplies and key weapons to help you on your journey, as well as occasionally triggering optional scenes and dialogues with your companion. As you explore, you will enter various types of structures around the city, ranging from a large regional bank to a Jewish synagogue, and each one has its own set of unique areas and hidden goods to discover. In each area, the dynamic environments are diverse and feel lived in, with old, overgrown furniture and walls all covered in moss and mold, making the moist, humid climate of Washington feel true to life. Overall, it is very rewarding to explore and find your way around the city at your own pace, but be sure to watch out for infected along the way. The environments later in the game become much more linear, however, and the small open world aspect slowly dissipates to cater toward progressing the story. The visuals range from beautiful to haunting, and anywhere in between according to the tone of the story and setting at the time. One region of the game takes place in a subway station, with bright red flares lighting up the area, and you see the enemies and the infected as nothing more than a black shadow in the distance. This somewhat limits your visibility at times and builds a sense of terror and suspense as you have to stay on your toes to prevent the infected from sneaking up on you.
Got another sandwich! Just get I got you! I got
As you explore the world and see the sights, the player character and your companions will react to the things they see across the map. They speak out in real time when you find new items and often engage in light conversation with you at opportune times, either about personal matters or the world around them.
Hey, Ellie. This place is a synagogue.
How can you tell?
One, there are menorah decorations on the wall. It's a Jewish thing. And two, I didn't burst into flames just now, so...
Burst into flames?
It's just a dumb joke.
Oh, unlike your other ones?
You shut it.
Oftentimes, explorable regions will include light platforming and puzzle-solving elements, allowing for a more dynamic sense of discovery and satisfaction as you wonder what lies behind a locked door, or swing across a gap in search of ammo. One of the big revelations in the game's marketing was the inclusion of a jump button. This was described as revolutionary, which I think is a bit of an overstatement. It's certainly fun, but it's not nearly as big of a presence as the early reveals made it seem. At times, there are some light platforming elements, often involving rope swinging or making big leaps across gaps and obstacles. It creates some interesting level design, which is fun to engage in and experiment with, scouring every inch of a room for supplies and hidden secrets. In combat, your enemies react realistically to your attacks, and even call out in anger or desperation when you kill their friends. This creates a strong sense of realism in the world, and one that allows you to feel the emotional consequences of your actions and ties the player to the world more directly, instead of just treating them as a bystander. Enemies will beg and plead with you as you hold them in a choke during stealth, which serves to make them feel much more human rather than just NPCs in a video game. This leads me to discuss the main combat mechanics of the game. In general, the core gameplay feels very familiar to anyone who played the first game. Gunplay is quick and extremely satisfying, and enemies fall and react to being shot in various ways depending on where you hit them. For instance, a headshot will result in them stopping in their tracks and falling dead instantly, and a kneecap shot will cause them to cower in pain briefly, stunning them and providing an opportunity for a follow-up melee attack. Pretty standard stuff for the series, but where things start to get interesting is the melee combat. At first glance, it looks roughly the same as in the first game, with various types of melee weapons ranging from sharp ones like the machete to blunt objects like lead pipes and wooden planks. Just like in the first game, you have the option to attach a blade to the weapon for a guaranteed one-hit kill on any normal enemy. This provides a decent alternative to gun combat, which is loud and resource-heavy. Where things change, however, is the addition of the dodge button. By pressing L1 in tandem with a swing from an enemy, you can sidestep or duck to avoid an attack, leaving them open to a counterattack. This is pretty standard in most action games, but it feels fresh and expected here, as things can get pretty tricky in close quarters environments and resources can be scarce, making melee combat almost inevitable. Getting good at dodges can be a lifesaver, as well as being extremely fun and satisfying, as the various weapon types have individual traits and benefits. Lighter blunt weapons, like the pipe or baseball bat, are fast and deal moderate damage, which is helpful when in direct combat with an enemy. Heavy weapons, like a camp axe or a sledgehammer, hit harder and deal much more damage, but are significantly slower, making them much more useful to strike a stunned enemy after a brick or bottle throw. The third kind of melee weapon is the one I found myself using only when nothing else was available, mostly because it just isn't nearly as fun in my opinion. Bladed weapons like machetes or hatchets are fast and swift, making them ideal for quick kills in direct combat. I found these the least satisfying of the three myself, simply because they lack the gratifying impact and visible damage of blunt weapons. The combat is gratifying and addicting to say the least, but the diversity does not stop at simple weapon variety. I can't talk about the fluid, dynamic gameplay adequately without acknowledging the existence of the two playable characters. Throughout the game you'll play as Ellie, of course, as the game's story kicks off, But eventually you are introduced to Abby, who serves as almost a secondary protagonist and major playable character. Say what you will of her presence in the plot, which I will get to later, but playing as her immediately shows a marked difference between the two. Ellie's attacks are imprecise and slightly cumbersome, reflecting her rough, dangerous upbringing and how she was forced into a life of survival with no formal training or practice. As such, the weapons and abilities you have at your disposal when playing her definitely cater toward a stealthier approach. Her stealth kills are slow and messy, leaving her enemies choking and gurgling on their own blood as they fall and die, and she wields firearms in an almost awkward manner. She looks confident in her form, but it's clear she learned under dangerous circumstances. Ellie is extremely resourceful, however, and uses her clever wit to craft trap mines and smoke bombs to gain an upper hand in battle, creating new tactical windows and opportunities for attack. Ellie also has access to her signature weapon, a bow and arrow, which allows for ranged stealth kills and is particularly effective against clickers. It is extremely satisfying to send arrows through the heads of infected and human enemies alike, and if done correctly can open up significant methods for combining stealth tactics with direct combat, and dipping in and out of stealth is satisfying and often effective. Though she lacks the grace and practice of a trained professional, Ellie's tactics are methodical and effective, always staying one step ahead of her enemies. On the other hand, Abby, the second playable character in the game, comes from a military background and has her expertise and generally intimidating physique to help her stay alive. She has a different arsenal of weapons than Ellie for the most part, mostly encouraging direct combat and tactical maneuvers. She wields a semi-auto rifle, a military pistol, a hunting pistol, and later on a crossbow and flamethrower. Stealth is absolutely still viable when controlling her, as silencers and crossbows are always readily available. Much like Ellie, Abby's combat mechanics reflect her background as a former paramilitary soldier, and she uses her training and physical build to her advantage. Abby is built like a truck. It's implied at several points that she works out routinely and has immense physical training. This being the case, her fighting style is hard and lethally precise, as she swings at enemies with the force of a cannon and smashes skulls with her gigantic biceps. Abby hits hard and it shows. In stealth, her kills are much faster and probably more humane than Ellie's, as she chokes enemies out and breaks their necks with the crook of her arm. Stealth tactics as Abby in general, however, feel slightly more limiting. Instead of proximity mines and smoke bombs, Abby only uses pipe bombs along with the usual bricks and bottles as her throwable weapons. These work essentially like grenades and can be tossed behind enemies to draw them out into the open or obliterate them from cover. While stealth is certainly possible and sometimes almost necessary as Abby, her equipment and playstyle seems to lend itself to frontline tactical combat and gunplay. Her weapons are mostly big and loud and deal heavy damage. She gains access to a flamethrower later on, which is instrumental in dispatching groups of infected or the stronger boss fights you encounter later on in the story. Overall, Abby plays technically the same as Ellie in terms of controls and core mechanics, but her equipment and skill set provide a hard-hitting, professional air to combat. Of course, combat means nothing without enemies, and The Last of Us Part 2 has no shortage of them. Aside from the usual runners, clickers, and human enemies that fans have come to expect, the game introduces several new foes to avoid along Ellie's journey for revenge. The first ones she'll encounter on her journey are a new type of infected known as shamblers. Shamblers are a big, brutish blob of fungal spores that spew clusters of mushrooms at you which deal damage over time. Encountering them for the first time is scary and intimidating until you find an effective way to dispatch them. They can be easily defeated with fire or explosives and maybe one or two shotgun blasts. Once I found this out myself, they became more of an annoyance than anything, and I saw them as nothing more than a smaller version of the bloaters from the first game. The other new recurring enemy that Ellie and Abby encounter are the Stalkers, who do exactly as their name implies. They stalk around dark areas of the map and hide from you, waiting until the opportune moment to strike from random corner while you're hunting them down. I found these ones to be significantly scarier than any other variant of the infected, with one exception, of course, since they were immune to the listen mode that is so important normally. Now, on your first playthrough of the game, you will definitely have access to listen mode, which essentially allows you to have X-ray vision and use your ears to see through walls and obstacles to where an enemy might be hiding. Normally, this provides for a decent amount of tactical planning and stealth maneuvers, but when faced with groups of stalkers in a building, it becomes effectively useless. Aside from the usual infected, this game amps up the stakes when it comes to human enemies as well. For instance, at several points throughout the game, you'll run into groups of soldiers and patrols with canine companions. Dogs in the game are a complete nuisance and often unhinge any of the best laid plans of attack, with their acute noses. In listen mode, you will gain the ability to see your scent trail, which tells you the perceived path of a nearby dog, and whether or not you're being tracked. It will be important to take them out as soon as possible, since they can blow your cover at a moment's notice. This new addition to enemy tactics requires you to think on your feet and keep moving during stealth segments, since staying in one place for too long can mean certain death. Dogs are effective and deadly at times, and so it's important to handle situations with extreme caution when they are present. Killing them will put enemies in a state of alert, but it's likely the best way to approach an area with dogs sniffing around. Killing dogs will elicit emotional responses from their owners, which can often feel heartbreaking and distraught, as if you just murdered their best friend. It's another part of the intricate attention to detail that serves once again to make the world feel real. Now, I think it's fair to assume that most, if not everyone, knew what to expect going into this game in terms of gameplay and combat, so I think it's finally time to address the elephant in the room. Probably the thing most people are criticizing, and the source of all the review bombs and low scores: the story. Most, if not all of it, was leaked mere weeks before the game's release, much to the dismay of director Neil Druckmann and the developers at Naughty Dog. Rumors of SJW agendas and forced diversity abound, with many critical comments being made on the game's perceived political stance, as well as the divisive decisions made by the game's lead writers. Well, are the rumors true? The short answer is yes, technically, but plenty of people got things misconstrued or flat out wrong about certain aspects of the plot and characters. Now, bear in mind, we are entering heavy spoiler territory, so be warned, if you haven't played or spoiled things for yourself already, watch ahead at your own risk. The Last of Us Part 2 holds on to the themes from the first game fairly well for the most part, with a sentimental undertone and plenty of symbolism and imagery. The beloved main characters from the first game make a comeback straight away, and we see that they are both alive and well, almost thriving in a new compound in Jackson, Wyoming. The story opens with Joel confessing to Tommy about his sacrifice of a vaccine for the virus in order to save Ellie's life. Right away, we are introduced to the recurring theme of guilt and shame that both Joel and Ellie feel for their respective actions in the previous game. Joel admits that he feels guilty and ashamed of what he did, but you get the feeling he would do it again if given the chance. As the prologue continues, we are shown that Joel and Ellie have grown distant over time, and several things indicate that they had a falling out at some point, and now simply coexist with one another in the town. This becomes much more clear later on once some small details of their story between the events of the first game to now are revealed. We're then introduced to the cast of characters, some of which feel more like archetypes and others who we expected to see from the first game, like Tommy and Maria. Once you gain control of Ellie, you quickly run into Jesse, a suave 20-something Asian American playboy who really only serves as a source of tension between Ellie and her girlfriend Dina later on. Dina is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of development. On the one hand, you get the sense right off the bat that her and Ellie have known each other for years, but on the other, it feels a little rushed. Throughout the entire game, it feels like Dina needed some more time to resonate with the player, and she never really feels like anything more than just Ellie's girlfriend. She's fun.
Hey, little help? Coming. You ever been to a courthouse before?
Nope. Well, we used to watch these cheesy 80s action movies. He's really into them.
Oh no.
I actually really like them too. What about you? What are you doing later?
Some people were talking about sneaking out. Going sledding.
That sounds fun.
Yeah. You wanna meet up after?
Okay. Maybe I'll play guitar for you.
Okay. What's Curtis and Viper 2 about?
Okay, so 2 former commandos that go rogue to fight bad guys. And I think in
Now back to the story. It finally kicks off as Ellie and Dina are out on patrol together. Jesse finds them and mentions how Joel and Tommy haven't returned from their patrol yet. Ellie becomes agitated and they head out in search of him. This is where the story becomes polarizing. Joel, a longtime father figure and protector of Ellie, as well as a beloved fan favorite character, is killed by a group of marauders led by Abby, who I mentioned before. We see Ellie's agonizing gaze as she watches him die and begs for his life as it is snuffed out before her. In a strange way, this represents a huge tonal shift in the story, and understandably so, this was a source of controversy and divisiveness among fans. Joel meant a lot to a lot of people, and seeing him die on screen elicited angry and resentful reactions from many, and sorrowful, understanding tears from others. It's important to look at Joel's death from a storytelling standpoint, however. He and Ellie have spent years now in a safeguarded township with minimal danger, aside from when they're on patrol, and to sacrifice the relative safety of their compound would be foolish. Something huge would need to happen for anyone to sacrifice a luxury in a world such as theirs, and Joel's death provides this for Ellie. An argument can be made that using the death of a beloved main character as a mere plot device is cheap and lazy, and to a degree I'm inclined to agree. There were other ways to spark another adventure. In a world as predictable as Joel and Ellie's, anything could go wrong. Still, the choice to kill off Joel in the story is not without its merit. It does, after all, fit thematically with the overall story, and represents a turning point for his relationship with Ellie. Later on in the story, it becomes clear that Ellie was made fully aware of Joel's actions at the Fireflies facility, and begins to resent him for taking away her chance at a meaningful existence. She's now forced to live in a hellish world, in a tedious, repetitive lifestyle with no hope for a cure, and her place in history was effectively robbed of her. Seeing Joel have his head smashed in right in front of her was essentially an end of the loop for Ellie, and she could finally begin to understand that he is merely human just like anyone else, and not without his flaws. As a player, the death of Joel is extremely shocking and likely infuriating, since it seems to come from nowhere and feels like a cop-out from the writers. It serves as a kicking off point for the rest of the story, where Ellie gears up and decides to hunt down Joel's killers in an act of revenge. Tommy heads out ahead of them in pursuit of Abby and her comrades, and Ellie and Dina follow behind, trying to catch up before he beats them there. Dina's choice to join Ellie feels a little expected, and honestly never really culminates into any specific character arcs for either of them. The two of them have some trials and tribulations with their relationship, but it always feels like the usual teenage romance tropes, both of them having hidden secrets and dark sides to their stories. Dina, having come from a more guarded home post-outbreak, isn't as much of a hardened survivor, and likely didn't have to fight for her life as directly on as much of a scale as Ellie. Having been born in a QZ run by Fedra, Ellie saw firsthand the horrors of humanity after the outbreak, and the violence and murder that occurred on a daily basis. Dina does give some insight on her past, having come from a Jewish heritage and a long line of survivors. Both of them have an interesting contrast in terms of their upbringing, but the story fails to capitalize on this. It does have a few heartwarming character moments, like Ellie's rendition of Take On Me, which serves to show Dina's admiration of Ellie, as well as Ellie's progress both as a musician and as a person.
Talking away, I don't know what I'm to say, I'll say it anyway. Today's another day to find you shying away. I'll be coming for you, love, okay?
Once you arrive in the small, semi-open world of Seattle, you are free to explore the region at your own pace, finding small Easter eggs, key weapons and supplies, and a few charming character moments between the two. Still, the whole time Ellie and Dina are interacting and surviving together, it's hard to shake the idea that something is missing. The cute conversations and dialogue between Ellie and Dina make for some charming moments for sure, but it fails to create a particularly interesting dynamic between them. Their relationship is never any deeper than blind love and admiration. Both of them seem ready to die for each other, but there is little to no context or backstory to justify their feelings for one another. They make a believable couple, but their chemistry isn't enough to carry the story in the same way as Joel and Ellie's did in the first game. The Last of Us was so groundbreaking back in 2013 because of its dynamic storytelling and convincing characters. Ellie and Joel had an entire game story to get to know each other, and as the story progresses, the two of them learn to love each other as Joel makes the difficult decision to doom humanity in order to save her life. The reason this worked so well is because Joel was essentially an everyman. Despite his age, he was basically the quintessential father figure, and anyone could see him as a good man, despite his actions. He was the person we all thought we would be in that same situation, sacrificing the whole world for someone you've learned to love. The ending is so powerful because of the ramifications of his sacrifice. Joel took away the only hope humanity had for a way to fight the infection simply because he didn't want to lose another daughter. Ellie believes him when he tells her the story of how there are more like her, and their story ends with a passage into the unknown, where seemingly anything could happen. The idea of finding a family in a world filled with death and sorrow is what carried the first game to such great acclaim from fans. It felt real and emotionally gratifying to see Joel and Ellie grow together through their experiences. The sequel loses much of that, as Ellie and Dina are similar in age and don't have as much room to grow in their relationship since they already committed to each other before the story kicks off. It would have been nice to see them grow as friends as the story goes on, only to develop feelings for one another over a natural course of events, and grow closer through their trauma, much like Joel and Ellie did. Instead, we are left with a pretty static power couple who are plenty likable, but leave a lot to be desired in their development. Really, though, the main problem with Dina is that she has no real personal stake in the plot. Joel didn't mean much to her, and the only reason she tags along is to make sure Ellie is safe. Her involvement in the story is never more than making sure the player has a companion to interact with as the game progresses. You could argue that she serves as an anchor for Ellie to the real world, and tries to prevent her from lashing out and acting without premeditation. However, this becomes pointless when the story continues and Ellie is left to her own devices, where she spends her time violently pursuing the former Fireflies that killed Joel, leaving a wake of death. Now, I mentioned Tommy before, who leaves on his own journey to seek out Joel's killers, and there really isn't much else to say about him. His character is criminally underutilized in the story, serving only to build suspense and to create a sense of partnership with Ellie later on. It makes sense for him to seek justice for his brother's death, but he leaves his town without one of its leaders and goes directly against his wife Maria's wishes in doing so. Tommy's personal journey leaves a lot of room for extra storytelling that never really gets explored, and I think this represents a bigger problem in the story as a whole. While Tommy murders and pillages his way through Seattle, Ellie and Dina follow his trail carefully and methodically, often picking up clues and key details about Abby and her friends. The problem here is that Tommy already did most of the work for them when it comes to finding out where she's located. It inevitably becomes a hunt for Tommy rather than a hunt for Joel's killer, and while that sounds fine on paper, it means Ellie has very little chance to show off what she's learned about people and how to deal with them. She simply follows the trail of breadcrumbs that Tommy leaves for her until she finally meets up with him in the end, which is where the story really begins. There is one aspect to the story that I found myself particularly conflicted about, and that is Abby's playable backstory. I mentioned previously how she is fully playable for a good portion of the game, and that's almost an understatement. Nearly half of the game's playtime is spent as her, which is often a mixed bag when it comes to player reception. Overall, Abby is decently fun to play, but it's much harder to resonate with her story right away. The point of making her story playable is to put the player in her shoes and understand her motives for wanting Joel dead. It's revealed that she's a former Firefly and was actually a part of the team at the facility that ended up at the scene of Joel's rampage from the first game. Abby's own father was killed, and Ellie, who represented a beacon of hope for humanity, ended up being lost to them for good. This is all perfectly logical for the most part, but where the problem lies is in how it is presented. Abby's story begins at the same time as Ellie's, but the game never throws you into it until the very end of Ellie's side of the story. It is equally important to understand the overall character arc of both characters, but it serves to derail the suspense built up when Ellie finally meets Abby near the end. Their final confrontation should be a huge climactic event, but the suspense that was built over the course of the game is immediately dashed when the story throws you into a brand new character arc right at the tail end of another one. Still, Abby's story is very much in line with the themes and tropes of the series overall, with several important characters being killed where they stand, and plenty of heart-wrenching character moments to justify the time it takes to culminate. At the midway point of Abby's story, she meets a boy named Lev, who is an outcast from another faction known as the Seraphites or Scars. The Seraphites are essentially a cult who worship their founder, a mysterious woman with no name, who becomes the central figure for the religion after her death. This is where another big source of rumors comes into play. All the rumors of a transgender character existing in the story are true, but the circumstances are much less understood by many who haven't actually played the game. The transgender representative in this game is Lev, a 13-year-old boy who runs into Abby with his sister after she is severely injured by the Seraphites. It's later revealed that Lev's original name was Lily, and the reason he was outcast was because he shaved his head, likely due to his identity as a boy, despite having been born female. Because of this, he was forced out of the cult and is now a target for them as a result. Lev's gender identity never plays a significant role in the story and is almost entirely missable if you aren't paying close attention to in-game dialogue. The cult calls him Lily, and he mentions that this is why he no longer associates with them, but decides not to talk about it with Abby. Aside from this, it never directly comes up again, and the story continues on as normal. Generally, I think transgender and LGBT representation is handled fairly well in this game's story, as it never feels forced or heavy-handed and happens in believable ways. The director clearly made a point to normalize Ellie's homosexuality and treats it like any other romantic subplot. From an outside perspective, it's easy to see why someone might assume that this and the existence of a transgender character would seem like an agenda being pushed, when you lack the context or lifelike characters and voice acting to complement it. The topic is handled masterfully by the writing, and is actually one of the few times I feel representation has been done properly. Anyone who assumed Abby was the transgender rep should see how much of a disaster that would be for Naughty Dog in terms of public opinion. Making the only trans character in the game be the main antagonist would be a dumb move for public relations, regardless of the quality of writing. Anyway, Abby's story is clearly meant to parallel that of Joel and Ellie's. She's a hardened survivor who inevitably faces trials and tribulations that make her value her humanity and come to terms with the world she now lives in. When she meets Lev, she is immediately hesitant and doesn't trust him, as he has ties to a dangerous religious cult that's been trying to kill her. However, he ends up saving her life, and she helps his sister in return, and even when she ends up dead anyway, Abby and Lev grow closer together thanks to their mutual respect and understanding of one another. Abby's story is perfectly believable, and you almost sympathize with her toward the end, but it still feels as if it should have been an extra expansion unlocked after playing the main story. I understand that it is important to know Abby's story in order to question Ellie's actions toward the end of the game, but making it a nearly 15-hour playable section of the game feels like overkill for someone the audience has no prior emotional attachment to. Abby's story does have its strong points, however. Her relationship with Lev is believable and heartfelt, and she ends up facing the bulk of the game's most interesting faction, the Seraphites. Of course, it would be negligent not to mention her encounter with the Rat King, a new type of infected that is probably more terrifying than any other you've met before. Still, it fails to really make the same emotional impact as Ellie's story does. It never felt like anything more than a distraction from the part of the game I really wanted to return to. I kept wishing I would just return to Ellie, and hoping every new chapter would bring me back to her, especially since the story grinded to a halt completely right before the climax, just to show the backstory of the main antagonist. Abby's story culminates in a pseudo-boss fight with Ellie, where she sneaks around the theater planting bombs and bombarding you with gunshots. She fights just like Ellie plays and is very clever and resourceful. It's a challenging fight for sure, but one that feels like an absolute slap in the face to the player. You spend a good portion of the game as Ellie, fighting to stay alive and avenge the death of her only father figure, and you empathize with her, rooting for her and wanting her to get her way. Now, that's not to say Ellie's actions should not have consequences. After all, that's the whole point of this story in the first place. However, forcing the player to assault and attempt to murder a beloved character feels like nothing more than shock value. Letting the player beat the living daylights out of Ellie might seem like a harsh dose of reality and a realistic reaction to the events of the story. Ellie's entire character arc is about her conflicting feelings toward Joel and her reaction to his death, however, and while Abby's attempt to kill her is understandable and almost expected, forcing the player to participate in it directly serves to invalidate their connection to Ellie as a character. In that moment, it makes Ellie the bad guy in an attempt to show that things aren't exactly black and white. Asking the player to kill their favorite character is an effective way to alienate the fans and make them want to stop playing the game, not because the story is unbelievable, but because it serves to punish the player for the actions of the characters. In a game like The Last of Us, that treats its story as a linear, cinematic spectacle, the player should be treated as a fly on the wall that simply sits back and observes the story as an outsider, participating only in the portions that require combat and tactical planning. It is not a role-playing game, where the actions and demeanor of the player are projected onto the main character, and your individual choices can make a difference. This is a significant downside to the medium in some ways, where the story always culminates in a predetermined outcome. Forcing the player to assault the main character as a shocking plot device just felt like an outrageous way to punish the player for actions that the game forced them to commit. If you had made these decisions yourself and had to reap the consequences, that would be one thing. But in a static, predetermined storyline, it should never be the fault of the viewer if a character becomes endangered or punished for their decisions. Ellie has a strange character arc in the story in general. At first, she is distant and resentful of Joel for his lies and deceit, but eventually decides to try and start looking past these things for the sake of their relationship. Flash forward to the day of Joel's murder, and Ellie is absolutely devastated and traumatized over having watched him die and being unable to help. This is perfectly understandable considering how much they went through together, but it seems almost bittersweet considering how rough their relationship was at the time. She had already begun to distance herself from him and likely felt less and less of a connection as time went on, even telling him to stay out of her life at one point. As she leaves in pursuit of his killer, she seems almost to abandon all of the things she learned from him, which was to cherish the little memories and learn to forgive. This is fine given the anger and hatred she must have felt, but once the story begins and you finally reach Seattle, Ellie's emotions become much less clear. Her and Dina have some witty banter and make jokes off of one another, and overall just seem to be happy-go-lucky about the whole situation. This leads me to believe that Ellie is merely hiding her true feelings in order to stay strong, which is supported by the pages in her journal, which are readable by the player. In it, you can see drawings of Joel with his eyes crossed out, accompanied by poems full of heartbreak and guilt. She clearly feels somewhat responsible for Joel's death and is obviously torn up about it, but she chooses to suppress these feelings in order to stay alive. By the end of the story, Ellie's emotions are much more front and center, as she begins to have flashbacks and PTSD episodes of Joel's death. Even when she finally finds Abby and her comrades, Ellie hesitates and actually surrenders to them, citing that she was actually the one that should have died, since it was her that was immune to the virus in the first place. After the fact, Ellie is seen living on a farm with Dina and her newborn son, who seem to have made peace with Joel's death and the fact that Abby escaped her grasp. Still, you see Ellie having flashbacks and anxiety attacks over her traumatic memories, and she is struggling to accept that she failed Joel yet again, nearly got Tommy and Dina killed, and did get Jesse killed for seemingly nothing. Ellie is then pulled from her peaceful home and journeys to Santa Barbara to find Abby, who has since been captured by a group called the Rattlers, who are basically just slave drivers. Ellie hunts down and kills the Rattlers only to find the skinny and malnourished Abby crucified in an open field alongside Lev, her newfangled longtime companion. Ellie inevitably challenges Abby to a fight to the death, at which she then wins, leaving Abby beaten and drowning her in the ocean. Ellie lets her live, however, which represents a huge moment of growth for her, as her memories of Joel flood back to her in the moment and she decides to let her go. Most likely, Ellie saw herself in Lev, with Abby as his protector and companion, which paralleled her own experience with Joel. Her attempt to forgive Joel finally came full circle when she released Abby from under the water as she finally understood why he made the choice to save her. As the story winds down, Ellie returns home to an empty house where Dina and her son JJ are missing. She takes one last look at the house and the guitar Joel gave her as a gift and leaves it all behind, walking into the distance to either return to Jackson or to give her life a new meaning. A large source of criticism about the story is geared toward the ending. Many people cited it as a cop-out from the writers, since Ellie lets the person she spent weeks hunting get away in the end, seemingly invalidating the entire story and all of the sacrifices made along the way. However, it seems almost as if the ending parallels that of the first game. There, Joel leaves the Firefly facility after massacring the entire staff and liberating Ellie from inside. Supposedly, Joel's rescue of Ellie at the end should invalidate their journey. Tess and several others were lost and killed on their journey to the Fireflies, and they spent weeks on the road fighting for their lives to get there. So if the argument that Ellie's sparing of Abby is to be believed, then it must be said that the ending of the first game is equally lazy, since Joel effectively invalidates their entire adventure. However, this is not usually the case. Most fans would never think to criticize the first game's ending, since it serves as the ending to a huge character arc for Joel, who had come to love Ellie like a daughter, and therefore sacrifices his own conscience for her. The same thing happens at the end of Part 2. Ellie spares Abby due to her realization of Abby's humanity. She sees herself in Lev and knows that she would likely be doing the same thing to him as Abby did to her if she were to finish the job. Lev would be left defenseless and alone, and the only person left who cared for him would be taken away for good. She makes the difficult choice to spare Abby's life in order to keep her conscience clear. In this sense, she is trying to be a better person than Joel. She understands much better her own survival is exactly what caused Abby's entire life to be filled with so much struggle. Essentially, both games end with a choice. Joel made the choice to save Ellie for her own good, and was willing to bear with the guilt of having sacrificed any hope for an end to the hell they live in. Ellie made the choice to spare the person she hated most because she realized what that meant for her and the boy she saw in the boat. Overall, the long-awaited sequel to one of the most critically acclaimed PS3 games was extremely divisive in its attempts to create a hard-hitting, gritty storyline full of questionable morality and character decisions that reflect the people we all hope we never have to become. Ignoring the inconsistencies in writing quality and severe pacing issues, the game is extremely atmospheric and features some of the best visuals of any PS4 game to date. It is absolutely stunning at times, with its vivid attention to detail and strong dialogue and cutscenes. The game plays very much like a 3-act play, only it struggles significantly from issues with pacing, character inconsistencies, and being far too long for its own good. Still, I think it's fair to say the excessive hate was undeserved, and The Last of Us Part 2 will go down as one of the most memorable and impactful PlayStation games of all time.
If I ever were to lose you, I'd surely lose myself. Everything I have found here, I'm not found by myself. Try and sometimes you'll succeed to make this man of me. All my stolen missing parts I've no need for any more, 'cause I believe, and I believe 'cause I can see our future days, days of you.